The desert wind carried nothing but dust and loneliness across the Badlands of Arizona Territory. That's how James McKenna liked it. For 5 years, he'd lived alone in his cabin, miles from the nearest town. He saved folks when he could, helped strangers who got lost in the canyon passes, but he never stayed long enough for folks to say, "Thank you." Never got close to anyone. That all changed the day he found an Apache woman left for dead in a ravine. By saving her, he started a journey that would cost him his old life, but save his soul. James had built his cabin near Redemption Gulch, a town that feared and hated the local Apache tribe more than rattlesnakes. The townsfolk whispered stories about savage raids that never actually happened. They locked their doors at sundown and taught their children to shoot first and ask questions later. Behind all this fear stood Bartholomew Kane, the richest man in 3 counties. Kane owned the bank, the general store, and half the ranches around town. But what he really wanted was the Apache sacred land, because he knew something the tribe didn't. There was gold in those hills, enough to make him richer than kings. Every morning, James checked his traps along the creek. He caught rabbits mostly, sometimes a fox. It was enough to keep him fed and give him pelts to trade. That particular morning started like any other. The sun barely touched the canyon walls when he headed out with his rifle and empty sack. He followed the creek downstream, checking each trap carefully. The 4th trap was empty but bloody. Fresh blood led away from it, down into a shallow ravine he'd never explored before. James followed the trail. At the bottom of the ravine, he found her. An Apache woman lay among the rocks, her dress torn and bloody. 3 bullet wounds marked her body, one in her shoulder, one in her side, and one that grazed her head. She was young, maybe 20 summers, with long black hair matted with blood and dirt. Her breathing was shallow, barely there. Most men would have walked away. James couldn't. He lifted her gently, surprised at how light she felt in his arms. She moaned but didn't wake. The climb back up the ravine nearly killed them both. Twice he slipped on loose rocks. Once he had to set her down to catch his breath. But he made it. He carried her to his cabin and laid her on his bed. For the first time in 5 years, someone else was in his home. James had learned some doctoring during the war. He cleaned her wounds with whiskey, picked out the bullet fragments with his knife, and wrapped her in clean cloth torn from his only good shirt. He made a poultice from desert herbs his mother had taught him about before she died. The woman burned with fever for 3 days. James stayed by her side, dripping water between her cracked lips, changing her bandages, keeping her warm when she shivered and cool when she burned. On the 4th day, she opened her eyes. They were the color of dark honey, and they looked at him with fear. James raised his hands to show he meant no harm. He pointed to himself and said his name slowly. She watched him like a hawk watches a snake. He brought her water, and she drank. He brought her soup made from rabbit and wild onions. She ate slowly, never taking her eyes off him. Days passed this way. She grew stronger but remained silent. James went about his routine, always leaving food and water within her reach. He slept on the floor by the fireplace, giving her the bed and space. Sometimes he caught her watching him as he repaired his tools or cleaned his rifle. Once, he thought he saw her almost smile when he burned the cornbread. She started moving around the cabin after a week. Small steps at first, holding the wall for support. James wanted to help but knew she needed to do it herself. Pride was something he understood. She examined everything in his simple home. His few books, his mother's Bible, the photograph of his parents he kept on the mantel. She touched each item gently, as if trying to understand him through his possessions. The supplies ran low after 2 weeks. James had no choice but to ride to Redemption Gulch. He showed the woman he was leaving, pointed to the sun's path to show when he'd return. She nodded, the first real communication between them. He left her his pistol, showing her how to lock the door behind him. The ride to town felt longer than usual. Redemption Gulch buzzed with activity when James arrived. More people than normal filled the streets. He tied his horse outside the general store and went inside. Conversation stopped. Eyes followed him. Old Sam, the store owner, barely looked at him while filling his order. James paid and started to leave when he heard loud voices from the saloon next door. Curiosity got the better of him. He stood near the saloon's open window and listened. Bartholomew Kane's voice boomed inside. The man was holding court, surrounded by his hired guns. Kane was describing how the Apache problem would soon be solved. He'd found their weakness, he said. Their precious chief's daughter had gone missing. Without her, the old chief would lose his will to fight. Soon, Kane promised, all that Apache land would be theirs for the taking. One of Kane's men laughed and said something about finishing what they started. Another mentioned 3 bullets should have been enough for any squaw. Kane told them to shut up, but the damage was done. James understood everything now. The woman in his cabin wasn't just any Apache. She was the chief's daughter, and Kane's men had tried to murder her. The ride back to the cabin passed in a blur. James's mind raced with the weight of what he'd learned. He was harboring the one person Kane needed dead. If anyone found out, they'd both be killed. But as he thought about the woman's eyes, her quiet strength, her trust in taking his pistol, he knew he couldn't abandon her. She was standing when he entered the cabin, his pistol aimed steady at the door. When she saw it was him, she lowered the weapon. For the first time, she spoke. Her English was broken but clear. She said her name was Naya. She thanked him for saving her life. James told her what he'd learned in town. Her face darkened with each word. Naya told him her story. She'd been gathering medicine plants near the border of their land when 4 men attacked her. They wore bandanas over their faces, but she recognized one by his crooked nose and missing fingers. James knew that man. Jake Morrison, one of Kane's worst killers. Naya explained that Kane had been trying to force her people from their ancestral home for 2 years, first with threats, then with violence. Her father, Chief Broken Arrow, refused to leave the land where their ancestors were buried. James faced a choice. He could send Maya away and go back to his lonely, safe life. Or he could help her and make an enemy of the most powerful man in the territory. Looking at her brave face, seeing the pain she tried to hide, the choice was already made. He would take her home to her people. They left at dawn the next day. Naya rode behind him on his horse, her arms around his waist for support. She guided him through hidden paths in the canyons, trails invisible to anyone who didn't know the land's secrets. They rode in comfortable silence, stopping only to rest the horse and drink from hidden springs she knew. The Apache village appeared suddenly, built into the canyon walls like it had grown from the rock itself. Warriors materialized from nowhere, arrows pointed at James. Naya spoke rapidly in her language. The warriors didn't lower their weapons, but they didn't shoot either. They escorted them into the village where women and children gathered to stare at the white man who'd brought their lost princess home. Chief Broken Arrow was old but strong, with eyes that seemed to see through skin to soul. He listened as Naya told their story. She spoke for a long time, gesturing occasionally at James. When she finished, the chief studied James with those penetrating eyes. Then he spoke in perfect English, surprising James. The chief had learned it years ago from missionaries, before the troubles began. The chief thanked James for saving his daughter, but said he couldn't stay. The village wouldn't accept a white man, not with all the pain whites had caused. Naya argued with her father in their language. Her voice rose with passion. Other voices joined the debate. Finally, the chief raised his hand for silence. He said James could stay 3 days. If in that time he proved himself friend, not foe, they would decide his fate. Those 3 days changed everything. James helped repair weapons, shared his knowledge of Kane's plans, and showed the warriors weak points in the town's defenses. He ate their food, learned some of their words, and watched their children play. He saw how they lived in harmony with the harsh land, taking only what they needed, honoring what they took. He saw Naya in her true element, teaching children, caring for elders, leading prayers to spirits he didn't understand but could respect. On the 3rd night, the village held council. James waited outside the chief's lodge while they decided. Naya came out hours later, tears in her eyes but smiling. The village had voted. He could stay. More than that, Chief Broken Arrow named him Friend of the People, a rare honor for any outsider. That night, sitting by the fire with Naya beside him, James felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years. He felt home. Weeks passed in the village. James learned their ways while teaching them his. He showed young warriors how to shoot rifles they'd taken from dead enemies. He helped build stronger shelters for winter. Every day he spent time with Naya, learning her language, teaching her more English. Their connection grew deeper than words. When she smiled at him, his lonely heart remembered how to beat with joy. But peace couldn't last. A young warrior named Running Deer arrived at the village, his horse nearly dead from hard riding. He brought terrible news. Cain had spread lies in town, claiming Apaches had attacked settler families. He'd formed a huge posse, over 50 men, and they were coming to destroy the village. They would arrive by tomorrow sunset. The village erupted in arguments. Some wanted to flee deeper into the mountains. Others wanted to meet Cain in open battle. Chief Broken Arrow looked old and tired, the weight of leadership heavy on his shoulders. James asked to speak. He proposed a different plan. The canyon approaches to the village were narrow, with high walls. A few men in the right positions could hold off an army. He knew every trick from the war, every way to make the land fight for them. Through the night, they prepared. James and the warriors set traps along the canyon floor. They positioned rocks above the narrow passes, ready to create landslides. They found perfect spots for ambush, where one warrior could seem like 10. Naya worked with the women to prepare bandages and medicines, knowing blood would flow before the day ended. Cain's posse arrived as the sun touched the canyon rim. 50 men on horseback, armed with rifles and rage. Cain rode in front, his black coat making him look like death itself. He shouted for the savages to come out and face justice. The canyon remained silent. Cain ordered his men forward into the narrow pass. The first trap was simple. Ropes across the path caught the horses' legs, sending riders tumbling. As men struggled to stand, arrows flew from above. Not killing shots, but rooms to slow them down. The posse fired wildly at shadows, wasting ammunition. James watched from his position, waiting for the right moment. The second trap was rocks. Boulders crashed down, blocking retreat. Men screamed in panic. Some tried climbing the canyon walls, only to find warriors waiting. Others pushed forward into the killing ground James had prepared. He picked his targets carefully, taking down Cain's lieutenants first, cutting the head from the snake. Cain himself pushed through the chaos, his eyes blazing with fury. He saw James on a ledge and recognized him. The rage on Cain's face turned to understanding. He shouted to his men that James was a traitor, that he'd sided with savages against his own kind. Some of the townsmen hesitated, confused. They'd come to fight Apache warriors, not white men. James stood up, making himself a target. He shouted down to the posse, his voice echoing off canyon walls. He told them the truth about Cain's greed, about the gold, about the attempted murder of Naya. He challenged any man there to say they'd actually seen Apache attacks on settlers. The silence that followed was broken only by the moaning of wounded men. Cain drew his gun fast as lightning. But James was ready. 2 shots echoed as one. Cain's bullet caught James in the chest, spinning him backward. James's bullet found Cain's heart. The land baron fell from his horse, dead before he hit the ground. The remaining posse members looked at their dead leader, then at the warriors surrounding them, then at each other. They'd been deceived, and they knew it. Old Sam from the general store raised his hands in surrender. Others followed. They gathered their wounded and dead, including Cain, and retreated down the canyon. No one pursued them. The battle was over. Justice had been served. But James lay bleeding on the ledge, his life flowing out onto ancient stone. Naya reached him first, pressing her hands against his wound, screaming for the medicine man. They carried James to the village, where the elders worked through the night with herbs and prayers. Naya never left his side, singing Apache healing songs, whispering English words of love, holding his hand as fever tried to claim him. For days, James walked the edge between life and death. He dreamed of his old cabin, empty and cold. He dreamed of his parents, calling him home. But always, Naya's voice pulled him back. Her touch anchored him to life. On the 7th day, his fever broke. He opened his eyes to find her sleeping beside him, her hand still holding his. Recovery took months. The bullet had done damage that would never fully heal. James would always walk with a limp, always feel pain when winter winds blew cold. But he was alive, and he was loved. The village that had once watched him with suspicion now treated him as a hero. Children brought him flowers. Warriors nodded with respect. Elders shared their stories and wisdom. Chief Broken Arrow performed the ceremony himself, binding James and Naya together in Apache tradition. James learned their prayers, their songs, their sacred stories. He hunted with the men, using Apache methods instead of his old ways. He sat in council, his voice carrying weight in decisions. His cabin near Redemption Gulch stood empty, slowly returning to desert dust. The town never came for them again. With Cain dead, his empire crumbled. The bank failed. The store closed. People drifted away to other towns, other dreams. The land Cain had coveted so fiercely remained with its rightful guardians. The gold stayed hidden in sacred ground, untouched and unimportant compared to the treasure of peace. James had lost his old life completely. The lonely cowboy who'd saved strangers but never stayed was gone forever. In his place stood a man who'd found family, purpose, and love. He'd learned that true courage wasn't facing death alone, but opening your heart to others. He'd discovered that home wasn't a place, but people who claim you as their own. Sometimes James stood at the canyon rim, looking toward where his cabin used to be. He thought about the man he'd been, closed off and hollow. That man had died the day he chose to save Naya. What rose from that death was someone better, someone whole. The Apache had a saying that translated roughly to losing yourself to find yourself. James understood it now. Years passed in the village. James and Naya had children who grew up speaking both languages, walking in both worlds. They knew their father's stories of the old frontier and their mother's tales of Apache heroes. They learned that love could bridge any divide, that justice sometimes required sacrifice, and that the greatest adventure wasn't conquering new lands but understanding different hearts. When strangers occasionally found the village, lost or seeking trade, they always marveled at the white man who lived as Apache. James would smile and offer them food and shelter, remembering when he too had been a stranger. He'd tell them how a single act of kindness, choosing to save someone different from himself, had led to justice for an entire people. He'd explain that true love meant finding a home not in a place, but in another person's heart. The story of the lonesome cowboy who accidentally saved an Apache princess became legend in those canyons. Travelers shared it around campfires. Mothers told it to children as proof that people could change. It reminded everyone that kindness could defeat greed, that love could overcome prejudice, and that sometimes losing everything you thought mattered was the only way to find what truly did. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in love that conquers fear and justice that defeats greed, then like this video and subscribe to hear more tales of the Old West. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Did James make the right choice? Could you leave everything behind for love? Let us know what you think about this story of sacrifice, justice, and finding home in unexpected places.